When 23-year-old Mia noticed the silver sedan parked across the street from the
Don't move.
diner for the
There's
third
a
night
hit
in a
out on
row,
you, and
she
it's coming from
tried to tell
inside the
herself she was
diner.
being paranoid, living in a city that never
Don't
slept.
move.
Seeing
There's
the
a
same
hit
car
out on
twice
you,
wasn't
and it's coming from
necessarily a
inside the
death
diner.
sentence. But when the four men from that car finally walked into her diner, sat at her table, and described exactly what time she walked to her bus stop, she knew she wasn't just being watched, she was being hunted. Realizing the police were too far away and the men were closing in on her exit time, she leaned over a table of Hell's Angels and whispered 5 terrifying words, "Those men are following me." What happened next proved that sometimes the scariest men in the room are the only ones who can keep you safe. Before we reveal the chilling items the bikers found hidden in the floorboards of that silver sedan and the brutal justice they served on the dark road home, I have to ask, have you ever had a gut feeling that saved your life? Tell us your story in the comments below. We read every single one of them. And if you believe that nobody should have to walk to their car in fear, hit that subscribe button and join our community of protectors. Now, let's go to a foggy, bone-chilling Tuesday night. At the midnight rail, Mia was a young woman who knew the value of a hard day's work and the physical weight of a double shift. For 2 years, she had been the backbone of the midnight rail, a 24-hour, greasy spoon diner that sat on the desolate edge of the city's industrial district. It was a place for truckers, graveyard shift dock workers, and the late-night wanderers of the neon-lit streets. Mia was known for her quick wit, her ability to memorize a dozen orders without a notepad, and her uncanny skill at de-escalating the rowdiest of crowds with nothing more than a stern look and a refill of coffee. But lately, that famous confidence had been replaced by a cold, nagging dread. Mia was being stalked. It had started subtly, a feeling of eyes on her back as she locked the heavy steel back in trance after midnight. Then it became more concrete. She began seeing a silver sedan with windows so dark they looked like ink. It followed her bus. It sat outside her apartment. It was always there, lurking just out of reach of the street lights. Mia had reported the vehicle to the local precinct, but the tired desk sergeant had simply sighed. Without a crime, a plate number, or a direct threat, honey, there's not much we can do. It's a free country. People can park where they want. But Mia knew the difference between someone parking and someone waiting. On this particular Tuesday, the fog was rolling off the harbor in thick gray sheets, swallowing the city and turning the street lamps into dim ghostly orbs. The diner was nearly empty, the air smelling of old grease and burnt coffee. There were only 2 tables occupied. In the far back booth, tucked into the darkest corner of the restaurant, sat the 4 men from the silver sedan. They had arrived at midnight, ordered nothing but black coffee, and spent 2 hours staring at Mia. They didn't talk to each other. They just watched her every movement. The way she wiped the counters, the way she checked the clock, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Every time she walked past their booth, the air seemed to grow 10 degrees colder. They would exchange quick, sharp whispers and flash thin, predatory smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They weren't there for the food. They were there for the clock to hit 2 o'clock a.m., the end of Mia's shift. Mia felt like a gazelle being watched by a pack of hyenas. She tried to stay near the front of the house, scrubbing the same spot on the counter for 20 minutes just to stay within the line of sight of the other customers. In the large circular booth near the front entrance sat the midnight crew, a group of 12 Hells Angels led by a man the whole neighborhood knew simply as Jax. Jax was a mountain of a man built like a brick fortress with silver-streaked hair tied back in a face that looked like it had survived 1,000 miles of gravel and wind. The Hells Angels were more than just regulars. They were a fixture. They liked the diner because Mia didn't treat them like one enters or movie villains. She treated them like men who were hungry and tired. She knew their names, their favorite desserts, and she never blinked at the patches on their vests. To them, Mia was the daughter of the diner, a girl they respected. Jax, however, was a man who noticed everything. He had spent 30 years on the road, and his survival depended on his ability to read a room. He noticed that Mia hadn't cracked a single joke tonight. He noticed that her hands were trembling when she brought out the cherry pie, and he noticed the 4 men in the back booth who were drinking their coffee far too slowly for men who were just passing through. Jax didn't say anything yet, but he moved his stool slightly so he could keep a direct eye on the back of the restaurant. Mia's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she had to refill the coffee for the men in the back one last time. It was the unspoken rule of the diner: keep the pots full. As she approached the booth, her hands were so cold she could barely feel the plastic handle of the pot. The lead man, a guy with a jagged scar across his knuckles and eyes as empty as a winter sky, didn't wait for her to pour. He reached out and clamped his hand around her wrist. It wasn't an accidental touch. It was a cage. You look tired, Mia, the man whispered. His voice is sounding like sandpaper on stone. You shouldn't be working these late shifts. It's a long, lonely walk to that bus stop at 2:15 a.m. Especially when you take that shortcut through the shipyard. Lots of dark corners there. Lots of places where a person could go missing and never be found. You ever think about how easy it would be to just vanish? The blood drained from Mia's face. The shortcut. She only took that when she was running late. They hadn't just been following her car. They had been walking her path. They knew her schedule down to the minute. They knew which street lights were out near the shipyard. She tried to pull her arm back, but his grip only tightened, his knuckles turning white. His fingers were like iron bands, bruising her skin. I have to get back to work, she managed to stammer, her voice barely a squeak. The man smiled, revealing a row of unnaturally white teeth that looked predatory in the dim light. Don't worry, we'll be right behind you to make sure you get where you're going. We're very protective of our investments. Mia finally yanked her arm free, nearly knocking the coffee pot over. She stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. She looked at the front door, then at the back exit, realizing that her car was parked 3 blocks away because the diner lot was being repaved. She was trapped. She looked toward the front of the diner. The Hells Angels were laughing. Big Mike was telling a story about a ride through the Mojave, and Jax was quietly reading a motorcycle magazine. They were in their own world, unaware of the predator who had just claimed a victim in the back of the room. Mia grabbed the coffee pot and walked toward the biker's table. She didn't go to the side to wait for an opening in the conversation. She walked straight to Jax. Her hands were shaking so violently that the glass scarves were rattling against each other with a frantic metallic clinking that sounded like a distress signal. As she leaned down, pretending to pour Jax's 5th cup of the night, she leaned in until her hair brushed his shoulder. Her voice was a terrified threat of sound, so quiet that only Jax could hear it over the roar of Big Mike's laughter. Jax, please. Those men at the back table. They've been following me for 3 days. They just told me exactly where I walk. They told me I was going to vanish in the shipyard tonight. They're waiting for me to leave. I think they're going to take me. I have nobody else to ask. Please don't let them. Jax didn't move a muscle. He didn't even look up from his magazine immediately. He didn't shout or start a fight. But Mia felt the energy at the table shift instantly. It was like a giant beast had just woken up and was deciding how to kill. The laughter at the table died down as the other bikers saw Jax's posture change. Jax's eyes, which had been relaxed, turned into cold gray flint. He slowly reached out and placed a massive warm hand over Mia's trembling fingers, steadying the coffee pot. Mia, Jax said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that felt like a distant storm. Listen to me very carefully. Go into the kitchen, lock the door, tell the cook to grab his meat. Cleaver, and stay in the walk-in. You, stay back there, and you do not come out. Until I knock on that door 3 times. Not twice, not 4 times. 3. Do you understand me? If you hear anything else, you stay hidden. Mia nodded, a single sob escaping her throat. She didn't look back at the men in the corner. She turned and walked into the kitchen, her legs feeling like they were made of water. As the heavy swinging doors closed, she huddled near the small circular window, peering out into the dining room. What happened next was a masterclass in silent intimidation. Jax didn't stand up immediately. He took a long, slow sip of his coffee, set the mug down with a deliberate clack on the table, and then looked at his brothers. He didn't need to explain. They had seen Mia's face. They had seen the man grab her wrist. The 12 Hells Angels stood up. In perfect hunting unison, the sound of 12 heavy leather vests creaking and the rhythmic thud-thud of engineer boots on the linoleum sounded like a drum beat of war. The 4 men in the back booth finally realized the air in the room had changed. They tried to stand up, reaching for the heavy pockets of their windbreakers, pockets that were weighted down by more than just cell phones. But they were too slow. Before the man with the scarred knuckles could even clear the bench, he was staring into the chest of Big Mike, a man who looked like he could pull a tree out of the ground. Jax walked toward them, his hands open at his sides, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. He didn't stop until he was inches from the lead stalker. He stood so close that the man had to crane his neck to look Jack in the eye. I hear you're a big fan of the shipyard at 2 o'clock a.m., Jack said, his voice dropping an octave into a dangerous whisperer. I hear you like following women who are just trying to make an honest living. Well, I have a new plan for your evening. We're going to go outside and we're going to have a little chat about manners and boundaries. You see, Mia is family and we're very protective of our family. We don't want any trouble, man. The scarred man said, his voice cracking and jumping an octave. We were just leaving. It was a joke. All right. Oh, you're leaving, Jack said, his eyes narrowing to razor-thin slits. But you aren't leaving in that silver sedan. And you aren't leaving until we see what's in that trunk that's making you so eager to get a young girl alone in the dark. Because I think you've got a lot of things in there that don't belong to you. The 4 men looked around. They were surrounded by 12 of the most feared men in the state. The diner's front door opened and 2 more bikers who had been outside smoking walked in. Sensing the tension, they moved to the door and crossed their arms, effectively turning the diner into a trap. There was no escape. Jax walked to the kitchen door and knocked 3 times. Mia opened it, her eyes red from crying. Give me your keys, Mia, Jax said gently. Big Mike is going to drive your car to the clubhouse. T-Bone and I are going to take you in the truck. You're under our shadow now. Nobody touches what belongs to us. As they led the 4 men out into the swirling fog of the parking lot, the atmosphere was thick with impending justice. Jax walked to the silver sedan. He didn't wait for a warrant or permission. He smashed the driver's side window with a single blow from his heavy silver ringed fist and popped the trunk. Inside the trunk was a nightmare kit. Rolls of industrial duct tape, heavy-duty zip ties, a bottle of chloroform, and a black bag containing a high-end digital SLR camera with a telephoto lens. But what made Big Mike growl and fury was the folder sitting on top of a pile of blankets. Inside were dozens of photos. Not just of Mia at work, but photos of her at her apartment window, photos of her grocery shopping, and a detailed map of her daily bus route with X marks at the darkest points of the shipyard. These weren't just stalkers. They were professionals. They were part of a larger, darker machine that preyed on the vulnerable, and they had been planning to take Mia that very night. Jax turned to the 4 men who were now being held against the cold brick wall of the diner by the other bikers. The rage in Jax's eyes was no longer cold. It was a white-hot sun that promised a long Painful night for the predators. He held up the folder of photos, the wind catching the pages. You chose the wrong girl, Jax whispered, leaning into the lead man's face. And you chose the wrong neighborhood tonight. You aren't the hunters. You're the catch. The heavy, suffocating silence of the foggy parking lot was broken only by the sound of the four men's frantic, shallow breathing. They were pinned firmly against the rough, cold brick wall of the midnight rail, their expensive windbreakers snagging and tearing on the masonry. Jack stood before them, his boots planted wide, holding the folder of surveillance photos like a death warrant. The realization that they weren't just dealing with a few angry bikers, but a highly organized, lethal brotherhood that had just uncovered a professional kidnapping plot turned the men's faces a ghostly, sickly shade of gray. Jax didn't yell. He didn't need to. His silence was a physical weight, far more terrifying than any scream. He looked at the specialized equipment spilling out of the trunk, the industrial-grade zip ties, the specialized camera, the dark bottle of chloroform, and then he looked back at Mia. She was standing by his truck, her small frame shivering despite the heavy leather jacket Big Mike had draped over her shoulders. The contrast was a visceral punch to the gut. The pure, calculated malice of the predators versus the innocent life they had planned to steal for profit. Big Mike, Jack said, his voice dropping into a low, lethal register that made the hair on the back of the men's neck stand up. Take Mia to the safe house. Put 2 men on the door. I want her in a room with no windows and a locked bolt. T-Bone, you stay here with our guests. I want to know everything. I want to know who gave them these photos. I want to know who is paying for the lease on that silver sedan. And most importantly, I want to know how many other folders like this are sitting in some dark room in this city, waiting for a clock to hit 2 o'clock a.m. Mia looked at Jax, her eyes wide, with a mix of terror and profound gratitude. Jax, please just be careful. These men, they talked like they had an army behind them. They talked like they were untouchable. Jax leaned down, his eyes softening for a fleeting second. The only piece of humanity he allowed to show. Mia, they have an army of shadows. We have an army of brothers. Shadows disappear the moment you turn on the light. Go now. You've done your part. As Big Mike's truck pulled away, tires crunching on the gravel, the atmosphere in the parking lot shifted from a confrontation to a cold-blooded interrogation. The 4 men tried to maintain their professional silence, but the Hells Angels didn't follow the rules of a precinct interview room. They knew that time was of the essence. If these men didn't check in with their handler via their encrypted radios soon, the rest of the ring would vanish into the city's veins. We're just the transport. We're just the muscle. The man with the scarred knuckles finally blurted out as T-Bone tightened a gloved hand around his windpipe. We don't run the show. We just get the targets from point A to point B. We were told she was a nobody with no family. Please, we were just following the data. Jack stepped into the man's personal space. His face inches from the scarred man's nose. Whose data? Give me a name, or you're going to find out exactly how deep the harbor goes and how cold the water feels when your feet are encased in concrete. The broker, the man screamed, the terror finally breaking his spine. He operates out of the old textile mill on 4th Street, the one near the abandoned canal. He's the one with the servers. He's the one who picks the girls based on their shift times and their lack of a social circle. He told us she was a ghost. Jack stood up and looked at his 12 brothers. The textile mill was a fortress of rusted steel, broken glass, and bad memories. A perfect hiding place for a shadow organization that fed on human misery. Mount up, Jax commanded, the word echoing off the diner walls. We're going to pay the broker a visit, and we're bringing his delivery back to him with a very loud message. The ride through the industrial district was a synchronized thunder that rattled the windows of every darkened warehouse they passed. 12 Harleys moved like a single predatory organism through the thick, swirling fog. Their headlights blacked out to avoid detection. They reached the old textile mill at 3:15 a.m. It was a sprawling 3-story nightmare of a building surrounded by a double-layer chain-link fence topped with jagged razor wire. Jax didn't waste time with a subtle entry or a negotiation. He drove his lead bike straight through the rusted front gate, the heavy chain link snapping like dry twigs under the force of the iron. The bikers spilled into the courtyard, their boots hitting the gravel with a rhythmic military thud. From the upper windows of the mill, shadows moved quickly. The broker's men were there, and they were armed with more than just zip ties. Spread out. Suppression fire only, Jax shouted as the first sharp cracks of gunfire echoed through the courtyard. The muzzle flashes lighting up the fog like strobe lights. The Hells Angels didn't panic. They had been in wars before, some in foreign lands, some on these very streets, and they knew how to use the environment to their advantage. They moved behind the rusted husks of old textile machinery, returning fire with a disciplined precision that caught the traffickers off guard. These men were used to snatching defenseless waitresses and runaways. They weren't prepared for a head-on assault by a legendary motorcycle club that fought for honor rather than a paycheck. Jax kicked in the heavy oak doors of the main floor, his silhouette framed by the orange glow of the battle outside. Inside the mill was a labyrinth of towering crates, spinning looms, and ancient filing cabinets. He moved through the darkness like a wraith, his senses tuned to the sound of shifting paper and the frantic, panicked footsteps of a man who realized his empire was falling. On the second floor, in a reinforced room cooled by industrial fans, Jax found the heart of the operation. It was a high-tech nightmare, a room filled with glowing monitors and hundreds of blue folders, just like the one he had found in the silver sedan. Each folder had a name, a set of candid photos, a home address, and a minute-by-minute schedule of the victim's life. It was a factory of human misery, a digital slaughterhouse. At the center of the room stood the broker, a man in a crisp 3-piece charcoal suit who looked more like a corporate accountant than a monster. He was frantically shoving hard drives and papers into a high-speed shredder as Jax entered. "You're late for your delivery. And you forgot the most important part," Jax said, his voice echoing in the hollow metallic room. The broker spun around, his face pale, reaching for a small silver pistol sitting on his desk. But Jax was a man born of movement. He closed the distance in 3 massive strides, his heavy engineer boot connecting with the broker's wrist with a sickening crunch. The gun clattered across the floor, sliding under a desk. Jax grabbed the man by his expensive silk tie and slammed him against a wall of metal filing cabinets, the sound echoing like a gong. "You think you can come into our neighborhood and treat people like inventory on a spreadsheet?" Jax growled, his hand tightening around the man's throat until the broker's feet dangled off the floor. "You think because she's a waitress, because she's alone, that she's a nobody? You think she doesn't have a father, a brother, or a protector? It's just market demand." The broker wheezed, his eyes bulging as his face turned a deep, bruised purple. "There's a demand for the untraceable. I just filled the supply. You bikers, you should understand that better than anyone. We both live outside the law." Jax's eyes turned into cold, dark pits of absolute zero. "We deal in chrome, gasoline, and brotherhood. You piece of trash. We don't deal in human souls. You aren't outside the law. You're beneath the dirt. Outside." The sounds of the skirmish died down as the Hells Angels neutralized the remaining guards. Big Mike and T-Bone burst into the room, their leather vests covered in white drywall dust and soot. They stopped dead, their eyes scanning the wall of blue folders. The sheer volume of the broker's work was enough to make the toughest man in the room sick. "My God," Jax, T-Bone whispered, flipping through a folder labeled Westside High Junior Varsity. "They've been watching the schools. They've been watching everyone. There are hundreds of them. Load it all up. Jax ordered, his voice cracking with a rare raw emotion. Every file, every hard drive, every single photo. We're taking this entire room too. The one honest cop left in this city. But first, the broker needs to see what his business looks like when the inventory fights back. The bikers didn't kill the broker that night. That would have been an act of mercy he didn't deserve. Instead, they zip-tied him to the very chair he used to plan his kidnappings. They placed the photos of his potential victims in a massive, haunting circle around him on the floor, so that everywhere he looked, he saw the faces of the people he had planned to destroy. Then Jax called the sergeant at the 4th precinct, the one man on the force who had always treated the club with a begrudging, honest respect. "Sergeant," Jax said into the phone, his voice steady as he looked at the broker's terrified face. "We've got a gift for you at the old textile mill on 4th. It's the biggest bust of your career, and you'd better bring every van in the city. You're going to have a lot of families to call tonight." By the time the sun began to peek through the industrial smog of the harbor, the mill was swarming with police lights and forensics teams. The sergeant walked through the room of files, his face pale with a horror that 20 years on the force hadn't prepared him for. He looked at Jax, who was standing by his bike, smoking a quiet cigarette as the morning air began to bite. "I didn't think it was this organized." Jax, the sergeant, admitted, his voice shaking as he held a photo of a missing girl from the next county over. "We've been looking for individuals, but you found a corporation. Because of you and that girl at the diner, we just broke the backbone of a national syndicate." "Don't thank me," Jax said, blowing a plume of smoke into the gray morning sky. "Thank Mia. She's the one who dared to speak up to a group of men she'd been told to fear. She's the one who decided she wasn't going to be a victim." The sergeant looked at the broker, who was being led away in shame, his silk suit ruined. "What about Mia? Is she safe? Does she need a witness protection?" "Detail. She's with the club," Jax said, his eyes narrowing as he kicked his bike into life. "And she's going to stay with the club until every name in these files is accounted for. She doesn't need a badge to protect her. She has the wing." Over the next month, the city's spirit began to change. The midnight rail became a symbol of the neighborhood's newfound resilience. The Hells Angels didn't just walk Mia to her car. They renovated the empty apartment above the diner and gave her the keys for free. They installed a security system that would make a federal building look vulnerable. And every single night, at least 4 Harleys were parked prominently outside during her shift. A silent warning to anyone who dared to look too long. Mia wasn't the scared waitress anymore. She was a woman who had looked into the abyss and survived it with the help of a family she never expected to have. She went back to school to study law, funded by a scholarship the club conveniently put together from the broker's seized untraceable cash assets. One evening, a year later, Jack sat at his usual circular booth. The fog was rolling in. Again, thick and familiar. But this time, the atmosphere in the diner was one of absolute peace. Mia walked over, her movements confident, her eyes bright and filled with life. She poured Jax's coffee before he even had to ask, her hands steady and strong. "Everything quiet on the front tonight, Mia?" Jax asked, looking out the window at the well-lit, safe street. Mia looked at the row of bikes outside, the chrome gleaming under the street lights, then back at the man who had quite literally saved her soul. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of pure familial love. "The streets are quiet, Jax," she said softly, her voice echoing with the strength of a survivor. "Because everybody in this city finally knows that the shadows don't stand a chance when the wing is in town." The story of the waitress and the bikers became a citywide legend, a reminder that justice doesn't always wear a uniform and that the most powerful protection comes from the people who refuse to look away. Mia had whispered 5 words into the ear of a stranger, and in return she had gained a Brotherhood that would last a lifetime. As the roar of the Harleys echoed into the night, the city finally felt like a home again. The predators were gone, the folders were burned, and the midnight rail remained a beacon of safety in the fog. Because as long as the Hells Angels were on the road, no one walked.